Since Einstein's publishing of Spatial and general relativity over a century ago, the world of physics has been unwittingly railroaded into trying to answer impossible questions, trying to prove impossible theories simply due to erroneous axioms created during a time in which our anthropic pride blinded us to the possibility that a more fundamental phenomena could be responsible for our reality. Perhaps part of the reason so many people find relativity, particle, and quantum physics to be so counterintuitive is because the foundations of these concepts is built upon flimsy logic. And from my personal experience trying to facilitate academic conversations with physicists, most of them are too scared to really poke at it, much less meet with someone who is smashing away at it with a hammer. Lest the wobbling tower of axioms comes crashing down around them, along with their career. But this very fear has stymied the progress of understanding. Academia's certainty being the very factor limiting the creativity with which individuals can express their observations of reality. We have been valiantly trying to fit the space-time square into the round hole of reality for over 100 years now. Yet we must admit that it has borne little fruit in the way of meaningful progress towards understanding the fundamental structure of nature or its manifestations. It has not answered questions about black holes, or gravity, or dark energy, or dark matter, or fine structure, nor does it offer any insight into consciousness or experience. Yet, I see PhDs being given to the most banal and meaningless papers, which only serve to reinforce a framework that has utterly failed to develop into a deeper, more intuitive theory. I know some people will call this idea gobbledygook or non-academic, but take the time to really hear what I'm saying, and you'll realize that I don't need a special piece of paper to tell me that I know how to think. Besides, I'm a 30, soon-to-be 31-year-old retired professional athlete who teaches kids to throw for a living and practices ontological philosophy for fun. I'm not meant to be taken that seriously. Praise Diogenes. So, seeing as how I have no career to lose and no reputation to keep, I figure I would make the perfect candidate to present a conjecture which falls well outside the comfortable little boxes of the standard model. As a disclaimer, I do not think this is a perfect theory of everything. This was a practice of philosophy, using basic logic to re-examine some of our most foundational blocks of knowledge and look for gaps. Also, I am not a gambling man, but I would like to propose a bet to you, the viewer. I would bet you $1 that by the end of this video, I will have changed the way you look at our reality and offered resolutions to many of the crises in the discipline of physics using a single framework. Although it's not exactly gambling when the probabilities are so heavily in my favor. My name is Kieran Lovegrove. Lovey to my friends, and I believe I've uncovered profound insights which will forever change the fields of physics, cosmology, biology, and more. And hopefully, shift our collective human consciousness to a more shared perspective. Space and time are not fundamental, and particle physics is silly. The concept of a fabric of space-time has been ubiquitous in physics for the last 120 years or so, and despite observation after observation punching literal holes in that fabric, we've held on to it like a blankie from childhood. Its threadbare form covered in the slobber and stains of those too scared or philosophically immature to let it go. Grow up, everyone. It's crucial we move on from this antiquated and crude topological model. My reasoning, in simplest terms, is that both space and time are emergent from a more fundamental force. This means both are objectively relative, depending on the observed variables which propagate them. Einstein knew his work was incomplete because of this fact. Relativity wasn't a solution to a problem, but a highlighting of the problem itself. Because why should relativity exist at a fundamental level at all? Well, relativity is not fundamental, but instead an emergent phenomena of space and time. However, its incompleteness is due to the fact that it does not account for the force which space and time emerge from. This means something more fundamental and non-relative must be propagating space and time. That more fundamental, non-relative force is absolute motion. Not the motion of matter as we understand it in Newtonian physics, but a pure binary concept of absolute motion in which it can only exist in one of two states: absolute stillness or absolute motion. 0 or plus or minus 1. 0. Absolute stillness being a system without any motion whatsoever. It is completely homogeneous and symmetrical. 1. Absolute motion being the totality of all dynamic activity in a system. Motion can also be referred to as action, however I feel that motion in this framework conveys the message better. Functionally, they are the same. Let's imagine a perfect void. No time, no space, no energy. This is the state of absolute stillness or absolute zero. We can confirm through observation that absolute stillness is not the fundamental state of our universe simply because, well, our universe exists. So we must conclude that our universe exists in a state of absolute motion. Understand that there can be no transition state between these binary of absolute stillness and absolute motion. It is a true binary. Our observable universe must either be in absolute stillness or in motion to some degree, with the totality of energy being far beyond our observational capabilities. Since we can conclude that absolute stillness has not been observed in any capacity and is theoretically impossible, we must also conclude that the entirety of the universe exists in a state of absolute motion and that we are able to view some fraction thereof. The trouble comes when trying to quantify absolute motion. If your parameters are 0 and 1, it may feel constraining. How would one perform any type of calculation in the real world? Well, firstly, we aren't looking for a unit of motion, but instead designing a framework in which motion is a fundamental force, which all reality is a consequence. This binary state does not imply Boolean discreteness, but serves as an ontological anchor, because within the bounds of 1 and -1, infinite decimal subdivisions represent all forms of observable complexity. I'm sure a number of you are already fuming that some nobody is claiming to have outdone Einstein, insisting space and time are not fundamental. Well, I also think the standard model is clunky and dumb. But before you click away to watch a real physics video, allow me the opportunity to walk you through the process of how I came to these conclusions, and believe me, you will see the same insights that I have. And trust me, my ideas become more blasphemous as the video goes on. The birth of an infinite universe. In order to tell the story of how a universe of absolute motion can exist, we are going to imagine its birth. Starting from a state of absolute stillness and following each step towards absolute motion universe. First, we must assume that from nothing, if nothing was ever a condition, something arose, again because we exist. To imagine this, we must create a theoretical construct to which all of reality is anchored. This construct is a point, which is a non-quanta, dimensionless marker denoting the opposite of nothingness. We shall place that point inside the nothingness of a perfect void, no space, no time, no motion. A point falling through a perfect void effectively remains in a state of absolute stillness, as without anything to provide relativity to its degree of motion, it cannot be determined whether it is in motion or still. While motion is absolute, its manifestation in reality, velocity, is relative to reference frame, and a void has no reference frame after all. In this configuration, nothing still exists, but a universe does not. The point is experiencing what Einstein described, falling without a reference and thus experiencing 0g. But we will see exactly why 0g is impossibility later on. So, in order to quantify motion, a framework must be propagated upon which it may be done. Let's take that point in the perfect void once more. On its own, it is a non-dimensional, non-quantifiable, theoretical construct. It does not carry energy, nor is it found in nature in any way. It is being used to demonstrate how our reality takes shape in a way that is intuitive, since my practical math skills are lacking. Non-existent. With that said, we currently have a point in a perfect void. No time, no space, no motion. However, upon the point's appearance in the void, another fundamental concept of reality emerges. You could argue this is as fundamental as motion. However, I believe this is a passive and invariant structure of reality. This emergent phenomena is what I call perspective. A perspective is one or multiple of any non-quanta point or points, which provide the anchors for the emergent properties of motion, such as space, time, and relativity. How does space emerge from motion? In order to establish space, perspective must move in any direction away from the point, as the dynamic state of motion is what propagates space. Upon the first instance of motion, the entirety of space propagates itself from a single-dimensional vector that has been established. From that single-dimensional vector, an equal and opposing dimensional vector appears, which must be considered its own dimension because relative to the perspective, the same energy cannot simultaneously flow in both directions at lower dimensions. 4 other dimensional vectors are formed along the perpendicular horizontal and vertical planes, which only now just exist. In each of these relative spatial dimensions, there is a nested dimension of non-relative spin, which is either right or left-handed. Thus, we have established space. This space exists in a minimum of 5 passive relative spatial dimensions, 1 active vector dimension, 1 active dimension of spin per dimension, and can contain infinitely more nested dimensions. At this point, the void, the nothingness, has been replaced by everythingness. All that was nothing is now something and has become an infinite scalar field of motion and probability. Space itself is now the pure representation of all the infinite possible probabilities of motion, and thus all probabilities of energy. And at this stage, energy is equivalent to motion, and thus they become interchangeable. In this model, the primordial energy still follows an analog of physical laws we observe today, one being the Pauli exclusion principle, in which electrons do not want to exist in the same quantum state as themselves. This principle is the reason it remains that there is something instead of nothing. In order to do so, we must apply the concept of the exclusion principle as a universal law. No two physically instantiated points or fields may exist in identical totality across all attributes. Nothing, however, is a completely homogeneous state. Absolute stillness, zeros across the board. However, this would imply that everything would be in the same quantum state, which breaks the universal exclusion principle. So the universe also obeys a zero exclusion principle, which prevents any quanta of the universe from reaching zero to avoid the instability of homogeneity. Thus, the universe remains in motion, and there is always something rather than the homogeneous nothing. Another consequence of the principle of motion is, once propagated, it cannot be destroyed or annihilated. This would reduce its quanta to zero, which is the only condition the universe avoids entirely following the zero exclusion principle. This is how a universe of infinite motion or energy can exist, infinitely propagating into higher and lower nested dimensions at an equivalent rate, thus rendering the expansion and reduction inconsequential. Energy expands and contracts infinitely, but on a local scale it has no observable effect. How does time emerge from motion? With space being established, we can now clearly see how time emerges. Time is equal to the rate of the vector spin of motion through space relative to local perspective and frame of reference's energy. Or, time is equal to the change in perspective over the local flow and density of AEther. We'll cover that later. Only with an established perspective and frame can time emerge and be measured, usually against a consistent rhythm present within that relative space and frame. In our relative space, we have a number of different ways of measuring time, all of which have some degree of variance from one another. None of them present an absolute time, and this is due to time being relative to the vector and spin of the relative space's motion through the larger flow of energy. In short, time is directional only as a projection of motion's vector field through perspective. Our time, for example, is relative to the speed at which our solar system moves throughout the galaxy. Using the rhythms of Sun, Moon, and Earth's orbit and rotations, we can gain a sense of our planetary time. Using the rhythmic oscillations of quartz or cesium, we can measure atomic time. But both of these examples are relative and neither agree with each other on what is absolute time. Any change to the input variables has a related effect upon the measurement of time. Use cesium-134 instead of 133, and you won't get consistent oscillation patterns that we rely on for our atomic clocks. Plus, it would only have its 2-year half-life to do its oscillations before decaying into barium-134, which itself would produce a different oscillation pattern. Therefore, due to its relative nature, time cannot be a fundamental structure of the universe. Instead, we should consider it a mathematical expression of the record of our motion through space based on the rhythms of our locally observable energies. So where does zero play a role in this framework? It doesn't. Zero is a lie. Zero is a conceptual myth we've mistaken for a physical law. It's the ultimate phantom. It cannot exist in nature because it itself lies outside of nature. We were fools to adopt a way of thinking that put zero as the base to quantifying anything, and it has poisoned physics. Where in nature can one observe a zero? I understand when it's used to quantify larger relative objects not being present, but the idea of zero as a mechanic of our universe is fundamentally just kind of dumb. It has long been the bane of mathematicians and physicists alike. Its very presence leading to catastrophic results like singularities and infinities where there shouldn't be. A zero in physics implies that somehow things could come to an absolute stop, which would break universal and zero exclusion. Somehow, we've allowed the limitations of our equation's ability to interpret the complexity of reality to have us chasing the phantoms of wave-particle duality. First, there is no such thing and no structure in the universe that resembles what we call particles. A particle, by definition, is a separate entity, a minute portion of matter. But in order for something to be truly separate, it would have to have a boundary which has zero contact with any other energy, an impossibility. We fundamentally know this, but physics has refused to completely scrap the idea of particles. The particle is an artifact, a byproduct of our lack of understanding of time. The only way to produce particles is to separate reality into discrete slices of time. However, due to the understanding that motion is absolute, there can be no separation in those slices of time, so the entire concept is flawed. When using that framework to observe reality and to observe the actions of energy in the universe, it's only natural that we see particles. We, in our measurement, have taken a snapshot of motion, a single frame out of a constantly moving image. It would be like me taking a photo of my cat. Upon taking the photo, I've effectively froze the motion of that space and created a physical, low-resolution recreation of it. But then it would be like me showing someone a picture of the cat and desperately trying to convince them that this is my cat, as if the photo were somehow a perfect recreation of the real thing. And then everyone would start praising the photo of the cat and measuring the photo of the cat, and then people would start claiming that the cat was in two places at once. Meanwhile, the real cat is still just walking around the room. A consequence of this picture theory of particles is wave-particle duality, which is the offspring of a critical misunderstanding of the mechanics of time. Many World and Pilot Wave at least had this going for them. They understood, at least somewhat, that energy continues past our limited observational capabilities. Combining my framework, along with a modified infinite Feynman path integrals, should produce fascinating results in experimental physics. How to resolve the zero issue mathematically. Everyone always talks about infinity being a difficult concept to conceptualize for people, that it is impossible to represent and that they shouldn't be present in physics. I find that ridiculous. Zero is a far more difficult concept to imagine. To prove it, I will provide a theoretical framework upon which new physics can be attempted, that removes the 0 point from the discipline altogether and creates an infinity that provides the basis for explaining all phenomena at all energetic levels. Take 1 and -1. Imagine them on a line graph with a 0 in the middle. Now, based on what I said earlier, 0 conceptually doesn't exist, so remove it from the line graph. What are we left with? What we are left with is what I call a bound infinite system, 1 and -1, which within its boundaries contains a natural infinity. This bounded open interval supports infinite decimal granularity, but excludes the central point of 0. Thus, no physical relative quantity, energy, mass, velocity, time, may reach or pass 0. Each and every decimal has a probability of occurring naturally, and since each and every infinite decimal between 1 and -1 can exist, they must. And thus an infinite amount of decimal quanta arrive from the bound infinite system. Given a fixed perspective, within a finite frame of reference, one could theoretically quantize any form of energy down to the most granular level. Importantly, at the subliminal boundary, there is no 0, but instead a non-quantifiable referential midpoint space between 0, 0, 0 repeating, plus or minus an n-1, a perspective. And at the opposite end, a 0.999 repeating, pushing the boundary of 1 and -1 ever further away, without them ever changing their value. Overlay this structure with the spatial dimensions, and a completely new representation of our universe is created, an infinite totality system. This framework, I believe, will change physics forever. How do motion and its emergent structures create such a complex reality? If we were to somehow observe the most fundamental level of reality in which the energy present is pure motion, we would see a roiling, churning sea of stochastic excitations of probability among the quanta. This is the birth of an infinitely expanding energetic universe. Initially in a state with no entropy, the point in the void, it would, upon first motion, instantly become one of extraordinarily high entropy, due to the appearance of infinite quanta and dimensions. The energy would refuse to stay in its lowest energy level, not wanting to be in the same quantum state as itself, due to the universal exclusion principle. Thus, it stochastically enters higher and more ordered energetic states as a means of avoiding the return to its lowest energy state. To do so infinitely, it would grow ever more efficient at packaging its energy into more ordered and stable states in order to prolong its decay back into the original high-entropy stochastic configuration. I know everyone will freak out that I'm saying the universe is fundamentally high entropy, but my argument is that an infinite totality system would have infinite probability. Infinite probability also means infinite disorder and infinite randomness, both of which are characteristic of high entropy states. So, it is not necessarily that the universe began with low entropy and tends towards high entropy. Instead, prior to its existence, the universe is in a state of absolute stillness, a no entropy state. Upon the first instance of motion, however, it is instantly, fundamentally high entropy due to the infinite probability of motion, and avoids reaching equilibrium by ordering energy into less stochastic, lower entropy configurations, some of which are nearly perfectly stable, and are what we observe as universal constants. The first level of reality is the highest possible state of entropy, infinite randomness and complexity from which anything that arises would be more ordered than the initial state. But when observed from local scale, the universe appears to go from low entropy to high. Therefore, our current observed ideas of entropy are likely due to our limited understanding of infinite systems. The universe isn't random in a purely chaotic sense. Its materia prima is fully encoded with infinite potential states, all evolving continuously. The position and resolution of the perspective and the interaction of the materia prima is what defines the outcome perceived. So what is this materia prima, this most fundamental form of energy? When I considered exactly what the material should be called, a theory from the 1880s kept kicking around my head. Not because I think the theory in its original form is correct, but because I think Michelson and Morley got the name of the substance correct. Luminiferous aether. Why would I bring up a theory from 1887 which was debunked and has been ignored for the last 120 years? Because I think conceptually it explains quite a lot, albeit with some modifications from me. More than anything, I think it sounds so much more elegant and beautiful than the standard model of particle physics. At the most fundamental level of the universe, the luminiferous aether is not what carries light like was proposed in the 1887 theory, but is the quantum field of energy which gives rise to it. The luminiferous aether field is born of motion. It is considered semi-interacting because it can only interact with itself through the transfer of motion energy. When interacting with itself, the luminiferous aether field can either have a null interaction, it can redirect vectors and spin, or it can transfer its motion into itself by making the local aether denser. When imparting force upon itself, thus making the local aether denser, it follows intrinsic geometry of the universe and forms an eddy due to turbulence. These eddies are spiracles, and as the eddy becomes denser and denser, the aether imparts more and more energy due to more and more of the aether being unable to pass through or have a null interaction. To avoid breaking the zero exclusion principle, the aether resorts to either imparting its energy directly by adding more total energy to the system through compressive forces, or through emergent Coriolis forces, due to the dimension of spin that is intrinsic to energy, imparting rotational energy into the system. However, other forces appear once the aether is in higher density, lower entropy states, such as friction, which arises if aether cannot freely flow, and thus heat and light are produced to attempt to offset the move away from high entropy. The luminiferous aether is ubiquitous throughout the universe, as it is the materia prima which gives rise to all other forms of motion, such as dark matter, dark energy, light, black holes, relative matter, kittens, you get it. How then do we explain things like the strong and weak force, or gravity, or electromagnetic forces? At the luminiferous aether level of reality, there is nothing other than the infinity of probability. Completely stochastic in nature, it is as low density as can be and near absolute zero cold. A second level of reality, in which the pure stochastic motion begins to organize itself in order to maximize conservation of energy, thus delaying the return to high entropy. The first shapes begin to emerge as the pulsating field of infinite probability begins to locally form repeating patterns, transferring energy efficiently through space as higher dimensional, denser organizations of the aether. What are these patterns, you may ask? They're formed by those eddies I talked about, spirals. This shape and its infinite variations of concentric spirals is fundamental to this layer of reality, and thus fundamental to everything. They arise from the emergent Coriolis forces of higher dimensional aether, which loses its frictionless, superfluid-like properties in exchange for lower entropy and higher energy density. Thus, the aether transfers more energy into this denser aether due to an increase in friction proportional to its density. The less dense the object, the more aether passes through in a null interaction, without imparting its energy. The more dense, the more the aether is compressed against it, as it cannot occupy the same space. It imparts more and more energy into the spiraling eddy, thus spinning it faster and faster. This is gravity. It is not an attractive force pulling objects of mass together, nor the curvature of space-time. It is the repulsive force of the aether interacting with denser excitations of itself and imparting more force, which is then organized into the most efficient shape for maintaining that momentum, preserving the inverse square law. This is the explanation for why galaxies are rotating faster at the edges than the center. As the luminiferous aether is made denser, its motion energy, which is traveling faster than the speed of light, is converted into various other forms of energy storage, which trade speed for density and structure at equal rates. The compression of more aether feeds the black hole at the galactic center. More and more energy is compressed into the lowest possible entropy state. Upon entering some critical non-zero bound, it re-expresses in a near single-dimensional jet of unthinkable energy from the poles, expelling a beam of extremely low entropy, maximum density energy, which would, after traveling incredible distances, lose structure due to friction and Coriolis forces, and return to a high entropy state, after forming endless other massive eddies along the way, which then carry their energy down level into smaller and smaller eddies. This means all information that enters a black hole is re-expressed in a coherent, non-random polar jet. Thus, black holes are not singularities, but entropy engines, information-preserving transmuters distributing energy throughout the universe. This structure resolves the black hole information paradox by conserving information in minimally entropic, one-dimensional jets, preserving unitarity and coherence without requiring event horizon collapse. And in an argument for why art should also be a part of science, a poem from Lewis Fry Richardson captures the essence of the idea perfectly. Big whirls have little whirls that feed on their velocity, and little whirls have lesser whirls, and so on to viscosity. Lewis Fry Richardson. Thus, forces like the strong force, weak force, and electromagnetism become much simpler to explain, as they are all just variant degrees of the action of the luminiferous aether. They all largely function the same way, but contain variable properties based upon the frame of reference, energy level, and interactions with other strata of interacting luminiferous aether. In conclusion, there exists a fundamental, semi-interacting substrate called luminiferous aether, which is compressible and stochastic at low density. Regions of increasing aether density experience internal spiraling geometry and external repulsive flow. Thus it forms turbulent eddies upon obstruction or compression and transmits all manifestations of energy and force. This is the framework upon which the new generation of physics should be built. The key to eventually extracting infinite energy will be due to our understanding of the fundamental shapes of the universe in motion. Consciousness and perspective. Now that there is a framework for the physical manifestations of the universe, we must tackle the problem of consciousness. Again, everything I'm doing in this video is a practice of philosophy. I am not claiming to have all the answers. But instead, I feel I've spent the last 20 years simply collecting much better questions. Eventually, I came up against a wall of questions which had no answer, nor could I find. And I felt it was my duty to develop my own. This is my best attempt at understanding the ontology of our universe, to examine the world through the lens of metaphysics and phenomena instead of rehashing the same scientific ideas which have produced no new global enlightenments in a century. Defining consciousness has been one of the most difficult parts of this process. Even consciousness in oneself is hard to fully grasp. However, with the introduction of perspective as a mechanism for the observer, a derivation of a many worlds interpretation and Feynman's infinite paths began to form in my mind. What if each possible path was, in itself, its own reality entirely? While it would share much of the same connected relative space as other parts, the variable of its motion would in turn alter the variables of any interacting paths. If we take the same idea and apply it to humans, we can infer that each and every human, due to the different phases of their perspective, experiences an objectively alternative reality to any other human. The perspective sits at the subliminal boundary of any given bound infinite totality system, and each perspective selects a unique trajectory from the bound infinity configuration space, thus producing a unique reality. A simple example of this is two people standing on opposite sides of certain numbers. A 6 is a 9 from the opposite side, a 4 is an H. Both people are looking at the exact same configuration of energy, but due to their different perspective, the information may contain different meaning, or may interact with the energy of the person differently. Thus, each perspective or meta-perspective propagates a unique consciousness, and those consciousness experience a distinct but structurally connected universe. Therefore, consciousness is not emergent from matter, but instead co-arises with differentiable perspective. So here it is, boiled down and reduced to the fundamental substrate. The universe isn't made of time, or space, or particles bouncing around a four-dimensional sandbox. It's made of motion, pure, absolute binary motion, dancing inside a bounded, infinite continuum where zero doesn't exist and symmetry can't survive. From that first unstable sameness came a point, and with it, perspective. From perspective came dimension, direction, entropy, and eventually you. Everything you see, feel, and measure is just turbulence in the aether. A frictionless storm of structure resisting collapse into sameness by self-organizing into denser, more stable, lower entropy states. Gravity isn't attraction, it's compression. And black holes aren't endings, they're bottlenecks, jetting reorganized information into new frontiers. Finally, consciousness is not a side effect. It's the observer inside the system, watching from the gaps in between, carving a singular thread through the infinite probabilistic space. This isn't just a new theory, it's a reminder. Physics didn't start with math, it started with philosophy. And maybe it's time it listened to her again. So, did I make good on my bet? I thought so. The donate button is under the video. If I didn't, please put your critiques in the comments below. I'm sure everyone would love to hear them. Look, this is a thought experiment at its core. While I believe it is an accurate ontology of our reality, I do not have the mathematical skills to prove it.
What about math?
No, not important.
It is a work of philosophy, but one that I am confident will spark the imagination of those willing to do the rigorous work to prove it. That is why I'm putting it out to the world, to you, because we need your imagination now more than ever. More importantly, I want to highlight how I came to these conclusions, because I think one component of it is extremely important. I began truly working on this idea in February of 2021, and it was first based on the idea that each configuration of energy must have its own unique frequency. It's come a long way since then, and by no means have I been consistently working on it these last 4 years. During that time, I played a professional baseball season, spoke up against the mistreatment of minor league players, co-led a successful effort to unionize those minor league players, developed a robust anthropological philosophy which dismantles our current ideas of what it means to be human and provides a mechanism for healing the human organism. Stay tuned for that. Developed a number of theories in neurobiology and psychopharmacology. Met and married my wife. Wrote an outline for an original animated series with her. And had my first child. Have I been able to do all this because I experience a disgusting amount of privilege? Yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to use that privilege for something truly meaningful. Any free time I've had, and there has been a lot, I've either been consuming new knowledge, re-examining old knowledge in the light of the new, or, and this is the most important one, faffing about, daydreaming, and wondering what if. Philosophy is the foundation of science. Somewhere in recent years, that connection has been lost. So focused on measurement and data were the disciplines of science that they lost their ability to be creative. Coupled with stressful university cultures consisting of impossible schedules, pitiful funding for student researchers, and professors so incompetent they make a powerful case for AI replacement, it is no wonder why science has slogged and now come to a screeching halt. For academia to heal and regain its respect, it needs space for open and expansive philosophical discussion. Hours dedicated to trying to expand the minds of others through conversation. Question and answer back and forth until a question is found to which none can answer. That is the true heart of philosophy. And finally, maybe if the uptight faculty and students of the Beyond Center at ASU had time for me, Or if Professor Mazumdar had time for me at the University of Arizona that day, we could have moved forward together. Maybe, if they had just slowed down, joined this strange person saying he'd found a gap in the logic of space-time for a walk and taken a hit of my J, and shifted their perspective a little higher, maybe they could have lived up to their name and truly gone beyond. But I imagine after all of this, I'm going to have zero time for you.